Rudo plummets into the pit, flames of garbage burning around him. His fists clench, his eyes blaze with rage. Trash beasts rise from the shadows, and over it all his vow, revenge. A wronged orphan, exiled to hell's dumpster, wielding new power to hunt the real monsters, revenge and society. But revenge is a double-edged sword hand in Gachiakuta. It may be the real pit. Is Rudo's anger his weapon or his prison? Revenge is one of humanity's oldest instincts. A wrong burns into memory, and the desire to strike back feels like survival itself. For Rudo, revenge isn't abstract, it's oxygen. He was accused of murder he didn't commit, cast into the pit like disposable trash. His rage is the only thing left that tells him he's alive. Psychology explains why. When everything is stripped away, family, community, belonging, revenge gives the illusion of control. It says, I may have lost everything, but I can still make someone pay. Studies show that in the face of powerlessness, the thought of revenge activates the same brain circuits as reward. It feels like justice, even if it's only repetition. But here's the trap. Revenge doesn't look forward, it looks backward. It ties the self to the wound, replaying it again and again until the injury becomes identity. And for Rudo, that's the danger. His self is not Rudo, the boy, not Rudo, the survivor. It's Rudo, the wronged. That identity feels powerful, but it's also a cage. Nietzsche warned about this trap in one of his most famous lines. Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster himself. Revenge feeds on itself, pulling the avenger closer and closer to the very cruelty he resists. The more Rudo fights to prove he isn't disposable, the more he risks embodying society's judgment of him as dangerous, violent, unclean. This is why revenge is a double-edged sword. Its energy it drives him to survive the pit, to pick up weapons, to stare down beasts born of trash and corruption. Without anger, he might be swallowed whole by despair. But with anger, he carries a different risk, becoming nothing more than the grudge itself. And that's the paradox. Revenge feels like life, but it also clings to death, the death of innocence, the death of the past self, the death of trust. If exile is the pit that swallowed his body, then revenge is the pit trying to swallow his soul. And when Rudo gains power in the pit, the question sharpens. Is this freedom more just another kind of cage? Power arrives like a gift that smells faintly of iron. Rudo's cleaner ability, whatever mechanics the anime gives, it's a tool that lets him survive the pit, cut through the fused polymers of a trash beast, wrench free a friend from a jaw of rust. It reads as liberty. At last he can do something the world above denied him. But every gift comes with contours. This one is not neutral. It is engraved with the same accusation that exiled him. You are dangerous. You must be contained. The weapon that saves him is also a reminder of why he was thrown away in the first place. That double edge is the first problem. Empowerment can feel like release, like the longed-for moment when helplessness flips into agency. When you have been powerless for so long, the rush of effective action releases an almost narcotic relief. The neurologic is simple. Doing something that stops threat gives reward. But psychology also warns that reinforcement loops can calcify into compulsion. If power reliably soothes the ache of humiliation, you begin using it not only to meet danger, but to soothe the inner burn. Empowerment starts to look like medicine, then like habit, then like craving. There is also the cycle of aggression to reckon with. Behavior begets effect as surely as affect begets behavior. You lash out, you feel vindicated. You feel vindicated, you lash out more. Over time, the behavior reconfigures the emotion. The act of killing a beast necessary. Time scan feed the very anger that drove you into the pit. The weapon becomes an instrument of mood regulation. It stabilizes shame for a while, but it also conditions the person to expect that only violence will relieve the sting. Catharsis, in that sense, is a dangerous therapy. It can work briefly, but it risks escalating the intensity and frequency of violence, because the mind learns to seek that relief again and again. Literature gives us a metaphor for this: the cursed weapon. Think of every mythic blade that honors its wielder's wish at the cost of something secret. The sword that guarantees victory also takes the wielder's sleep. The gift that solves one problem often amplifies another. High's cleaner power is functionally the same. It grants him capacity, but it also amplifies the psychic material he carries. If your identity is tethered to being the wronged one, any tool that lets you act on that identity will tend to lock you deeper into it. There's another sting in the tail: stigma. Power can be liberating for someone with status. For someone stigmatized, power can re-signify them as a threat. Above ground, Rudo's accusation labeled him dangerous. In the pit, he learns to live into that label on his own terms, but the label remains a voice. When he returns to the world of action with lethal skills, the same society that once shoved him away will look at him and see exactly what it feared. Proof. The weapon cleans the pit, but for the outside world it is evidence of contagion. The tool that heals becomes the sign that he is tainted. And yet, paradoxically, Rudo's acts are also cathartic and real. He saves people with the very thing that could damn him. He earns trust. He earns loyalty. He reclaims agency. The problem isn't the power itself. The problem is what animates it. When force is instrumented by purpose that includes compassion and restraint, it can be a legitimate means. When it is animated primarily by the need to erase the wound within, it becomes a propulsion toward escalation. So, his fights are double-edged rituals. They are catharsis, yes, and they are escalation, too. Each victory paints over the ache for a moment, but also asks for a larger victory next time. Strength, in his hands, is never neutral. It is impregnated with the anger that birthed it. That is the burden. The more he wields his power to prove he is not the thing society labeled him, the more he risks becoming indistinguishable from it. Power can free you, but only if you refuse to let it define you. When Rudo joins the cleaners, his ability will be tested not just by the monsters he meets, but by the ethic that governs its use. Will the weapon be a tool of justice or merely a sharper chain for a grudge? The cleaners present Rudo with an ethic as much as a group, a practice of confronting the pit that is methodical, communal, and restrained. Their work is framed as cleansing, not vengeance. They don't hunt for spectacle. They clear zones, salvage what can be saved, and protect the living. That distinction, cleaning as repair versus hunting as revenge, is crucial. It asks a moral question: are we acting to repair the world or to settle scores? Philosophy draws a clear contrast. Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative asks whether an action could be willed as a universal law. Isis, in this moral architecture, is principled and impartial. It does not hinge on subjective humiliation. Revenge, by contrast, is deeply personal. It answers hurt with a desire to make a particular agent suffer. Kant would demand that a response to wrongdoing be framed in a way you would want everyone to adopt. Revenge fails that test because it privileges the avenger's wound above generalizable moral law. For Rudo, this distinction matters daily. The cleaners give him scripts, norms, and fellow laborers who inspect his motives. When he kills a beast to open a safe route, that's a utilitarian, perhaps even Kantian, act aimed at preserving lives. When he stalks a human scapegoat because they once fingered him, that is revenge. The problem is that revenge can wear the halo of justice. It can be verbally justified with promises of making things right, while structurally it repeats the original harm, using violence as a method of moral reparation. Group identity helps herein complicates it. Social identity theory shows that belonging to a group provides new standards and mirrors. The cleaners offer Rudo an in-group that will praise acts aligned with their mission and sanction acts that simply gratify personal vendettas. In that sense, the communal ethic is curative. It reframes aggression as service rather than spectacle. And in doing so, it can transform the fuel of anger into disciplined action. The cleaners turn individual rage into collective purpose. We clean so others can live, not I hurt so I feel less small. But there's a serious moral hazard. Group norms can ossify into a new orthodoxy. Cleaners might teach restraint today and sanctify purging tomorrow. The machinery of collective justification can become a shield for violence that would otherwise be judged cruel. The difference between justice and revenge depends on the integrity of the norms and the reflective capacity of the group's willingness to ask whether their clearing is restorative or merely performative. Rudo's moral education will hinge on this communal mirror. Do his fellows model accountability, or do they reward spectacle? Another philosophical lens helps sharpen the stakes. Restorative justice versus retributive impulses. Retribution centers on proportional punishment. Restoration centers on repairing harm and reintegrating persons. The cleaners, ideally, lean into restoration. They clear hazards so people can return. Salvage community infrastructure. They create conditions for life. Revenge, on the other hand, replicates exclusion. It expels, it punishes, and it leaves the structural causes untouched. For Rudo, the shift is existential. He must learn to say, I suffered, therefore I serve, instead of I suffered, therefore I strike. That change requires not only willpower, but institutional support, rituals, rules, and reflective feedback from comrades who will call him out when he slips. Kana gives the cleaners can be the crucible where his fury is annealed into discipline, where they can be the tinder that feeds it. Revenge isolates, justice integrates. Kana, the cleaners, offer him a chance to turn that inward wound outward into purpose. But the danger lingers. What if Rudo's rage doesn't transform? What if it corrodes at the edges of the group and becomes a new logic of exclusion disguised as cleansing? The next section will trace how vengeance can mutate into corruption and whether Rudo can avoid becoming what he hates. Revenge is a rehearsal. It asks you to replay the scene of your hurt until the score settles and the wound feels paid. That repetition is comforting in a perverse way. You keep doing the thing that once fixed a humiliation, convincing yourself that the next act will finally make the ledger balance. The problem is that the ledger never balances. It only grows. Each act of retaliation writes another line. Each new verdict demands another. Revenge mutates into a loop that mimics the original cruelty it claims to oppose. For Rudo, the pattern is painfully literal. The society that exiled him punished him with blame and abandonment. He learned to expect hostility, to move like someone who is always in the wrong. When he strikes back, he risks adopting the same logic the city used, exclusion as remedy. If the city expelled him to feel clean, then his vengeance can become a method for proving his own cleanliness by making others dirty. The more he punishes, the more his acts begin to look like the punishment that birthed him. Taya becomes identity. Buddhism names this trap in stark practical terms. Anger and revenge are fuels for suffering. They do not consume only the target. They consume the carrier. The image is of fire. At first, fire is warmth and light. Later, an uncontrolled blaze that devours the cabin. Holding anger nourishes a heat that calcifies into habit. You call it righteous fury. It hardens into a bone. In that transformation, the person who sought to repair an injustice is slowly made to carry the posture of the wrongdoer. The very acts meant to reclaim dignity can, paradoxically, strip dignity away. There is a psychological mechanism at work as well. Moral outrage produces a chemistry in the brain that rewards retaliatory behavior. Each successful strike reduces tension and produces short-term relief, but the relief is shallow. It does not address the underlying injury. Worse, the satisfaction conditions the mind to seek the same relief again, escalating intensity to chase the diminishing return. What starts as a single, desperate act becomes a habit loop. Habits calcify into character. The avenger, over time, is the sum of their retaliations. We also have the phenomenon of moral mirroring. When you enact the same method as your oppressors, you risk not only emulating them, but also validating the structure that made the initial harm possible. If the city justified exile by asserting that certain bodies were dangerous, then Rudo's acts of punitive violence can be interpreted by observers in the same idiom. Here is the proof you needed. Tia, the risk is perverse and tragic. In trying to prove his humanity by inflicting punishment on others, he supplies the evidence that once justified his disposability. In narrative terms, Rudo's shadow grows with every swing of his blade. Jung would note that the shadow is what we deny in ourselves and then see erupt in others. Vengeance brings the shadow out of hiding and folds it into the self. The boy who once fled now learns to hunt. The hunted becomes the hunter. But the hunter's techniques are borrowed from the culture that taught him to fear. He is learning the language of exclusion and making it his own. There's also a communal hazard. When a group permits or glorifies acts of punitive violence, the social norms shift. The cleaners, if unguarded by reflection, could drift into sanctioning ever harsher purges under the banner of safety. Cleansing becomes a performance where the moral psychology of the mob replaces ethical scrutiny. Revenge then evolves from individual compulsion into a social technology for controlling marginal populations, precisely the mechanism that produced the pit in the first place. That is the knife edge on which Rudo walks. Each beast he kills is an immediate victory, and each victory buys breathing room. But each victory also deepens the grooves of the pattern that birthed his suffering. He must ask himself a question that is ethical and existential. Is survival via replication of cruelty worth the cost of becoming the thing that made him suffer? If he fails to answer carefully, vengeance will not clarify his story. It will close it. The boy who sought to be free will be trapped in a new system of enactment and reaction. The violence meant to redeem him will instead enroll him into the lineage of the violent. In short, to fight monsters is not merely to defeat claws and maul. It is also to resist the temptation of becoming a monster in spirit. So the question of Rudo's path is not only whether he survives the pit, but whether he survives himself. We can stitch these threads into a single frame. Revenge gives motion, but it may also harden motion into prison. 3 philosophical lenses draw the perimeter of that paradox. Nietzsche warned us first, in fighting monsters, beware becoming what you despise. The line is not rhetorical. Power shapes character. Rage is the engine of your action. You risk configuring your soul to the geometry of that engine. Rudo's capacity to wield force risks reconfiguring him into a living echo of the city's cruelty. Kant offers a corrective. The categorical imperative asks whether an act could be universal law. Justice real, justice real, justice real, acting from maxims you would will everyone to follow. Revenge, by definition, fails this test. It is particular, spite-driven, contingent on personal grievance. While it may feel morally satisfying in the moment, it cannot be elevated to a universal standard without imploding into perpetual cycles of retribution. Buddhism diagnoses the phenomenology. Anger is suffering's fuel. Clinging to grievance keeps the self bound to the past. Liberation requires release, not triumph. The peace that follows relinquishment is not weakness. It's freedom from a repeating script. So what does that mean for Rudo? His revenge functions as both engine and cage. It pushes him to act when otherwise he might have been swallowed by despair. Without it, survival in the pit might be impossible. Yet the same motor that propels him forward also narrows the road behind him. Each act of vengeance is a rung he climbs and an iron he binds to his ankle. The central thesis, therefore, cannot be sentimental. Rudo's revenge is not simply justified or unjustified. It is dialectical. It is the necessary fuel for a rebirth that must be retooled, or it becomes the mechanism of another fall. Victory over trash beasts is not final if victory internalizes the logic of exclusion. His tragedy, or his salvation, depends on whether he can master the urge for payback or be mastered by it. Koi. There is a human test embedded here. Mastery of revenge does not mean abstaining from all force. It means orienting force under principles that survive scrutiny, principles that could be universalized, principles that aim at repair rather than spectacle. It means that the cleaners and Rudo within them must cultivate reflection, rituals that mark what is restored, not merely what is destroyed, deliberative practices that differentiate necessary removal from punitive pleasure. The pit isn't only filled with beasts of garbage, it's filled with beasts of memory. Te, will his power cleanse? Will his power cleanse? Or will it corrode? His tragedy, his salvation lies in whether he masters revenge or is mastered by it. Because in Gachiakuta, the most dangerous monster may not be in the trash pile but in the grudges we carry within. In the next episode, we'll ask, what does redemption look like when it's forged in violence? Can a soul reshaped by rage rebuild toward mercy? Or will the very act of rebuilding reproduce the ruin?